The most important word in John's Gospel does not appear in John's Gospel. Not once. Every other New Testament writer uses it. Matthew uses it. Paul builds entire letters around it. But John, who wrote more about believing than any other Gospel writer in history, refuses to use the noun form of the word at all. He only uses the verb, and the difference between those two forms of the same word is the difference between something you put on a shelf and something you do with your body right now. That is what John was engineering. And once you see it, you cannot read his gospel the same way again. Before we get to the word itself, we need to understand the man who chose it. And to understand the man, we need to understand the moment. By the time John sat down to write his gospel, the world had changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the 12 men who first followed Jesus along the shores of Galilee. Jerusalem was gone. In A.D. Tuchipol, the Roman general Titus marched his legions into the city, dismantled the temple stone by stone, and scattered its population to the wind. The historian Josephus, writing in the decades that followed, recorded the devastation in terms that still carry weight across 2,000 years. He described rivers of blood in the temple courts and the flames consuming everything the Jewish people had been told God called home. The first generation of eyewitnesses was almost entirely dead. Peter had been executed. Paul had been executed. James, the brother of John himself, had been put to death by Herod Agrippa around AD 44, one of the earliest apostles to be martyred. By the time most scholars date John's Gospel, somewhere between AD 85 and 95, John was likely the last living member of the original 12. He was writing from Ephesus, a city on the western coast of what is now Turkey, a place the early church leader Irenaeus described as John's home in his final years. Irenaeus knew this because he had personally known Polycarp, who had personally known John. That is how close we are to the source. John did not write into a vacuum. Matthew had already been circulating for decades. Mark had already been circulating. Luke had already been circulating. The basic story had been told well, told in detail, told from multiple angles. What John understood, sitting in Ephesus at the end of a very long life, was that the church did not need another timeline. It needed to understand what the story meant. And in particular, it needed to understand one thing. The other three Gospels had not pressed directly enough. What does it actually mean to believe? That question is the spine of everything John wrote. And the answer begins with a single Greek verb. The word is pisteuo. It means to believe, to trust, to lean your weight on something as if it will hold. In the Greek New Testament, this verb appears across every writer, every letter, every gospel. But John uses it more than anyone, roughly 98 times across 21 chapters. That is more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke combined. When you read John, you are reading a document that is saturated, soaked, structured around this single act of trust. And here is the detail that changes everything. In Greek, a verb and its corresponding noun are two different words, but share the same root. The verb pisteuo, to believe, has a noun form pistis, which means faith. Pistis appears 243 times in the New Testament. It shows up in Matthew. It shows up in Mark and Luke. It is everywhere in Paul. The letter to the Hebrews opens its famous chapter 11 with a definition of it. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. John does not use that word. Not once. Not in his gospel. Not in his 3 letters. He reaches for it 98 times, and every single time his hand lands on the verb, never the noun. Scholars who work in New Testament Greek have noticed this for centuries. What they have not always done is explain why it matters for the person sitting in a pew or reading their Bible in the quiet of a Tuesday morning. So here is why it matters. A noun is a thing you possess. A verb is an action you perform. Pistis. Faith is something a person can claim as a category of ownership. I have faith. I possess this. It sits on a theological shelf in my house alongside my other beliefs. My denominational preferences. My church membership. My baptism certificate. I acquired it at some point. It belongs to me. Whether I am currently doing anything with it is a separate question. Pisteuo. Believe. Does not work that way. A verb has tense. It happens in time. You are either doing it right now or you are not. There is no such thing as a dormant verb. You cannot be currently believing in the same sense that a chair can currently be sitting in a corner. Believing is present tense. Active voice. An ongoing motion of the will toward a person. And John, with the precision of a man who had thought about this for 60 years, refused to let his readers flatten that motion into a possession. If this kind of study is opening the text for you in a way you have not experienced before, please consider subscribing and sharing this with someone who is asking hard questions about faith. That is genuinely how more people find this content. And to everyone who has already done that, thank you. You are part of why this work continues. Now watch how John builds his entire gospel around this verb. Because it is not just a word choice, it is an architectural decision. Every major section of the gospel is designed to provoke Pisteuo and then test whether the reader is actually performing it. The gospel opens not in Bethlehem and not at the Jordan River. It opens before creation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. John chapter 1 verses 1 through 3. The Greek term translated word is logos, and logos carries more freight than the English can hold. In Greek philosophical tradition, logos was the rational ordering principle behind the universe, and the intelligence that held everything together. The reason that prevented the cosmos from collapsing into chaos. Greek thinkers from Heraclitus to the Stoics had been circling this concept for 5 centuries. They believed the universe was not random. It was rational, sustained by something they could name but not locate. In the Hebrew scriptures, the parallel concept moved differently. God's word was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a creative event. In Genesis chapter 1, God speaks and things appear: light, water, land, life. The Hebrew word dabar means both word and thing, because in the Hebrew imagination, what God says and what God makes are the same act. John takes both streams and says, the logos you have been philosophizing about and the dabar you have been reading about are the same reality. And then he does something neither tradition saw coming. He says the logos became flesh and dwelt among us. John chapter 1, verse 14. The rational principle behind the universe put on skin. The intelligence that spoke matter into existence learned to get hungry and tired and sunburned. John does not ease you into this. He drops it in verse 14 with no apology. And after that prologue, John makes a second choice that separates his gospel from the other 3. It hides inside another Greek word, Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe the miraculous acts of Jesus using the Greek word dunamis, power, mighty work. It is the root of our English word dynamite. A dunamis is an event that impresses you. It calls attention to its own force. Look what happened. Look, what power did that? John never uses that word. In 21 chapters, describing water turning to wine, a dead man walking out of a tomb, a man born blind, suddenly seeing, John does not once reach for dunamis. He uses a different word entirely, semeion, sign. The difference is not cosmetic. A dunamis says, look at what happened. A semeion says, Look past what happened to who did it and what they are claiming. A sign does not point to itself. A sign points somewhere else. And John selects exactly 7 of them, arranged in a deliberate, escalating order. The first sign is water turned to wine at a wedding in Cana. John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. A matter of chemistry. One substance becomes another. The second is the healing of a royal official's son in Capernaum, accomplished from a distance of roughly 20 miles. John chapter 4, verses 46 through 54. Distance is no longer a factor. The third is the healing of a man at the pool of Bethesda who had been unable to walk for 38 years. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Time itself is reversed. The fourth is the feeding of 5,000 people from 5 loaves and 2 fish. John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. The laws of matter bend. The fifth is Jesus walking on the surface of the Sea of Galilee during a storm. John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. Physics yields. The sixth is the healing of a man who had been blind from birth. Not an injury. Not a disease that developed over time. Blind from the moment he entered the world. John chapter 9, verses 1 through 41. Biology at its deepest level is overturned. The seventh is the raising of Lazarus. 4 days after burial. John chapter 11, verses 1 through 44. Death itself is undone. Notice the architecture. Each sign extends further than the last. Each one presses into territory the previous one had not touched. And John places each sign in front of a discourse, a long teaching from Jesus that explains what the sign means. The bread multiplied. Then Jesus says in chapter 6, verse 35, I am the bread of life. The man born blind sees. Jesus has already declared in chapter 9, verse 5, I am the light of the world. Lazarus walks out of the tomb. Jesus has already said in chapter 11, verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life. The sign is never the destination. It is the door. And Jesus stands on the other side of everyone, making a claim about who he is. These I am statements are the heartbeat of John's theology. There are 7 of them, and none appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. I am the bread of life. Chapter 6, verse 35. I am the light of the world. Chapter 8, verse 12. I am the door. Chapter 10, verse 7. I am the good shepherd. Chapter 10, verse 11. I am the resurrection and the life. Chapter 11, verse 25. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Chapter 14, verse 6. I am the true vine. Chapter 15, verse 1. The Greek behind I am is eimi. And this is where the language opens something important. In Greek, the verb eimi already contains its subject. Saying eimi alone means I am. Adding the pronoun ego on top of it is grammatically redundant. It does not need to be there. But it is there. And its presence is emphatic. The force is something like I, myself, am. It is weighted speech. And in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, ego, eimi, appears in a specific and loaded set of passages. In Isaiah, God uses the Hebrew phrase ani hu, I am he, to distinguish himself from every other claimant to divine authority. The text in Isaiah chapter 43 verse 10 reads, Before me there was no God formed, and neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am the Lord. That anihu became ego eimi in the Greek. The same phrase shows up in Isaiah chapter 48 verse 12 and connects back to what God told Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3 verse 14. I am who I am. So when Jesus says ego eimi without a metaphor attached, as he does in John chapter 8 verse 58, The people standing in front of him understood exactly what he was doing. The exchange is worth sitting with. The religious leaders have been challenging Jesus, invoking Abraham as their greatest ancestor. And Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am. Not I was. Not I existed. I am." Present tense. Eternal tense. The tense that belongs to the God of the burning bush. They reached for stones. That is the only commentary John needs to give. Now watch what John does with the crowd responses as the signs escalate. At Chana. The text simply says, his disciples believed in him. Chapter 2, verse 11. After the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd tries to seize Jesus and make him king by force. Chapter 6, verse 15. After the healing of the man born blind, the religious authorities throw him out of the synagogue. Chapter 9, verse 34. After the raising of Lazarus, the chief priests plot to kill not only Jesus, but Lazarus himself, because too many people were believing on account of him. Chapter 12, verses 10 and 11. The signs do not produce uniform results. They divide. The more clearly Jesus presents himself, the more sharply the audience splits between those moving toward him and those moving away. And John is recording this deliberately. He is showing you that evidence alone does not produce Pisteuo. Something has to happen inside, the person looking at the evidence. The sign can open the door. It cannot make you walk through it. This tension comes to its sharpest point in the farewell discourse, which occupies chapters 13 through 17. The longest sustained private teaching from Jesus recorded anywhere in the four Gospels. Nearly every word of it exists only in John. It opens with an act that would have stopped everyone in that room cold. Jesus gets up from the table, removes his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, pours water into a basin, and begins washing his disciples' feet. In the ancient world, this task belonged to the lowest-ranked household servant. Roads in first-century Judea were unpaved. Sandals were open. By the time a guest arrived at dinner, his feet carried the accumulated grime and waste of every street he had walked. Washing them was not a gesture of kindness. It was a job that no person of any standing would perform for another. Jesus performs it for 12 men, including the one who, within hours, would hand him over to be executed. Peter's resistance is not polite discomfort. It is genuine horror. The hierarchy of the universe has inverted in front of his eyes. The one John has spent 13 chapters identifying as the Logos, the Creator. The I am is on his knees with a basin of dirty water. Jesus uses a word for what he has just done that appears only here in the entire Gospel. The Greek word is hupodigma. It means a pattern, a model, a copy to be followed. He says in chapter 13, verse 15, "I have given you an example, that you should do as I have done to you." The sign of this evening is not bread and wine. It is a towel and a basin. And the discourse that follows goes to places the other three Gospels never approach. Jesus introduces the Parakletos, the helper. The word appears only in John's writings, nowhere else in the New Testament. It comes from two Greek roots, para, meaning alongside, and kaleo, meaning to call or summon. A parakletos was a legal term for a person called to stand beside you in court, to speak on your behalf when you could not speak for yourself. Not a distant advisor, someone physically present next to you, arguing your case. Jesus uses this word 4 times across chapters 14 through 16. And then he says something in chapter 16, verse 7, that the disciples must have struggled to absorb. "It is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Helper will not come to you." Think about that. 12 men have been walking physically alongside the Son of God. They have eaten with him, heard him, watched him raise the dead. And he is telling them that something better is coming. Not a replacement. A different kind of presence. Because the Spirit will not walk beside them the way Jesus has walked beside them. The Spirit will dwell inside them. Chapter 14, verse 17. The presence of God, which had been external and physical, was about to become interior and permanent. Then, in chapter 15, the teaching moves to an image rooted in the agriculture of that region. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Chapter 15, verse 1. The command that follows is repeated 11 times across this section. One word. Meno. Abide. Remain. Stay. Take up residence and refuse to leave. Meno is the relational partner of Pisteuo. If Pisteuo is the act of leaning your weight on Jesus, Meno is the act of staying leaned. Not a single decision made at a prayer meeting 15 years ago. An ongoing posture. A daily, moment-by-moment refusal to detach. And then comes the most absolute statement Jesus makes anywhere in the Gospel. Without me, you can do nothing. Chapter 15, verse 5. Not little, nothing. And in chapter 17, Jesus prays. Not to the crowd, not even to the 12, though they are present. He prays to the Father. And in the middle of that prayer, he says in verse 20, I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. Those who will believe through the word of the apostles. That sentence reaches forward through every century between that room and this moment. If you have ever trusted Jesus through anything, these 12 men passed down. Through the scriptures, through the church, through the testimony that survived them. You are in that sentence. Jesus prayed for you by category before he walked to the cross. He knew the word would reach you. He asked the Father to keep you when it did. So step back now and look at what John built. He opened with the identity of Jesus before creation. He chose a word for Jesus' acts that forces you to look past the event to the person. He selected 7 signs in escalating order. Each one followed by a discourse where Jesus explains what the sign reveals. He recorded 7 I am statements that exist nowhere else in the 4 Gospels. He gave us the farewell teaching, the foot washing, the promise of the Spirit, the prayer that includes everyone who would ever believe. And he did all of it without once using the noun form of the word faith. He used only the verb. 3 things worth carrying out of this. First, belief in John's Gospel is never passive. The Greek verb pisteuo is always something you are currently doing or currently not doing. There is no neutral position. John wrote a gospel of motion, not a gospel of position. And every story in it, Nicodemus at night, the woman at the well, Thomas in the locked room, is a story of someone either moving toward Jesus or not. The question the gospel presses on every reader is not, did you believe at some point? It is, are you believing right now? Second, the signs in John are designed to do something inside you, not just inform you. This is the difference between dunamis and semeion. A sign points past itself. Every one of John's 7 signs is asking you a question. The question is not, is this impressive? The question is, what do you make of the person who did it? John selected these 7 events not as a highlight reel, but as a cumulative argument. And the argument lands on your doorstep with a verdict to render. And the third thing, the one that stays with me the most, is this: John never names himself. Across 21 chapters of theology, so deep it has occupied scholars for 2,000 years, he refers to himself only as the disciple whom Jesus loved. He had every credential to cite. He was an eyewitness. He was at the Last Supper close enough to lean against Jesus. He was at the cross. The only one of the 12 to show up. He was the first disciple to reach the empty tomb, and after 6 decades of reflection, The only identity that mattered to him was not what he had done. It was what had been done to him. He had been loved. That was the sentence his entire life had been trying to finish. And that is the identity John's Gospel offers to everyone who reads it. Not the credential you hold. Not the correct doctrine you can recite. Not the years you have attended. But the love that reached you, found you, and refused to let the noun form of the word be enough. The verb is still in motion. It is asking you something right now. Subscribe if this opens something in John's Gospel you had not seen before. Leave a comment. Even one word. Share this with someone who has been sitting on the noun for a long time and has not realized there is a verb waiting for them. That is genuinely how more people find this content. Please keep us in your prayers as we keep working through these texts. God bless you.